Are you guys ready? Are you ready? Well, it's time for something new. It's definitely time for something new. Something that's 35% faster than a GTX 1080, the world's #1 gaming graphics card. Something new that is faster than Titan X, 3,584 CUDA cores, 11 gigabytes of frame buffer memory, 11 gigabits per second, nearly 500 gigabytes per second of frame buffer bandwidth with the new G5X memory, the ultimate GeForce. Ladies and gentlemen, the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti.
This here, in my opinion, is one of the best looking graphics cards ever made, an EVGA GTX 1080 Ti SC2. And would you believe it that these are selling today for under $200 USD? Obviously they have to be used, they don't make these cards anymore, but they are incredible values for the money spent. And in this video, we're gonna discuss why. I hope you'll stay with me. We do a lot of PC fixings on this channel, but much of that troubleshooting discipline bleeds over into other areas, including automotive. So when your car refuses to start on a random Tuesday morning, it's time to whip out the trusty Type S portable jump starter, a 12-volt, 1,000 amp power bank. Just hook these bad boys up to your suspect battery. Remember, positive to positive, negative to negative, but don't worry, this thing's basically foolproof. Just follow the instructions via the built-in LCD and you'll be up and running in no time. The Type S also includes convenient features like a built-in LED flashlight for working in the dark, wireless charging for your phone, and a convenient weatherproof design, all for an affordable price. If you ask me, this is peace of mind for virtually any car in virtually any environment, and you can easily store it in a glove box or under a seat and forget about it until you need it. Trust me, you'll thank me later. With over 1 million units sold in store, check out the Type S portable jump starter sale today on Amazon, linked below. Let's kick this one off by discussing specifications. I know for some of you this is going to be a pretty in-depth refresher because this card has really been under the radar for several years. Now those who dabble in the used market all the time are probably well aware of the 1080 Ti and its relevancy today. It is still a solid 1080p, and as you'll see in this video, even light 4K gamer, and its 11 gig frame buffer is a huge help. So this specific model, the SC2, again from EVGA, has a base clock of 1556 megahertz, boost up to 1670. The memory clock is of course much higher, 11 gigahertz or thereabouts. 3,584 CUDA cores in this. This is a 10 series CUDA core generation. Of course, PCIe 3.0 compatibility, 11 gigs of memory, and a 352-bit bus, giving us memory bandwidth of about 500 gigabytes per second. I think it's slightly lower than that if we do the math. Port selection at the rear does sort of give away the card's age. The inclusion of a dual-link DVI port is the dead giveaway, although I imagine not a lot of folks use this for their 1080 Ti's. We do still have 3 DisplayPort 1.4 ports back here and an HDMI 2.0B. This variant also supports only a single 6-pin and an 8-pin, although if I recall correctly, some 1080 Ti's do have dual 8 pins, so just keep that in mind. Make sure that you're picking a card that is at least supported by your power supply, and if your power supply doesn't have 2 8-pins, you probably shouldn't be pairing it with a 1080 Ti to begin with. The other thing I want to mention is that this particular SKU is also quite slim. It won't stick out very far from your PCIe slot area of your motherboard, which means it should be compatible with most mid-towers. NVIDIA does recommend a 600 watt or more power supply for this graphics card, although in our testing we've gotten by with much less. You could probably even squeak out something like a 450 watt unit if you paired this with a fairly efficient platform and CPU. Now this card's design is absolutely striking, and again, this is I think one of the best looking graphics cards ever made, in my opinion. You do have this nice brushed metallic feeling shroud, so if you turn your card vertically, this is what you're gonna see. You can see through into the fin stacks below. Absolutely beautiful looking card. Of course, you get your 2-piece backplate up top. This is a more premium card, at least it was when it first came out, so these are pretty much all gonna come with backplates, and you get a 2-fan design. Now these fans will stop when the card isn't under load, so if you buy one of these used, don't freak out if the fans aren't spinning immediately. They will turn on, or at least they should, when the card is under any sort of sustained load. It's actually nice that these don't spin all the time. It means your system's gonna be quieter when it's not working very hard. And as I said, these can be found all day on sites like eBay for around $200 or less. I don't recommend spending more than $200 for the premium models. They're not gonna give you that big of an advantage over, say, a 2-fan design like this one. I found this for 175 bucks, out the door shipped. It was about $200, and I think that's about the sweet spot for these. Now this graph reveals the raw 3D Mark Times by mean graphics scores for a slew of graphics cards. I kind of just picked these out of a hat. I wanted some AMD cards as well. I tried to pick a lot of cards that were either around the same price point or around the same score, the same performance level. Some are newer, some are older, but I think you get the idea. Anything from a GTX 980 Ti scoring around 5785 up to an RTX 4080, its average score of 28,189 pretty much dwarfs everything else on this chart. But if we swing it over to our graphics card value chart, you'll see that the RTX 4080 actually becomes the worst value of all the cards here. So while it is clearly the best performer, it's also by far the most expensive, which makes it not really a great value. And we pulled used prices for all of these cards, including what RTX 4080s are selling for on eBay today, which is around 900 USD. We're not using MSRP for any of these. Now you can see our GTX 1080 Ti sits fairly comfortably in the mid-50s on our value chart, and while this might not seem all that great compared to some of the other cards here, you have to keep a few things in mind. Firstly, I intentionally chose graphics cards that I knew would be decent values in today's market. So cards like the GTX 1080, the GTX 1070, 980 Ti, the RX 5700 XT, you can kind of see the trend here. Cards that are at least a couple generations old, that have already depreciated a good bit, but that still perform well with most of today's modern games. That said, I did sprinkle a few newer cards in here. Of course, the RTX 4060 and 4080s, you can see those aren't necessarily great values here, and that's to be expected because these cards really haven't leveled out in the used market. Second, the GTX 1080 Ti has an 11 gig frame buffer, which makes it slightly more appealing than other cards that might be a bit newer. Consider the RTX 2070 Super. While this has DLSS and ray tracing baked in, it's a first generation product. It doesn't perform as great in those areas as its newer counterparts, and it only has an 8 gig frame buffer compared to the 1080 Ti's 11. Some value that more than others. One thing I would like to do before we put this card through any extensive testing is remove the cooler and repaste. This card is again going on about, 6 to 7 years old, thereabouts, and as a result, it's likely that this paste is a bit old. So we can keep temps down. That might allow the card to boost a bit higher. In fact, just based on this warranty sticker here, which is covering one of the screws that holds the back plate to the cooler underneath, I'd say this card has never been opened before. Full disassembly on this card is pretty straightforward. You've got a bunch of screws holding the back plate in. These are all just longer Phillips screws. There are 4 retention screws as well. They're gonna surround the GPU itself, pretty typical of most modern graphics cards. I started by removing these first and then removing all the Phillips screws around the back plate. Once that was pulled off, I flipped the card over. There were 3 more retention screws holding the shroud to the top side of the PCB. And then after 3 wire disconnections, I believe 2 of these were for the LEDs and 1 was for the fan assembly. We can see the PCB underneath. Now, this is still covered by, looks like half of a shroud. We're not gonna bother disassembling any further than this. I don't imagine much dust got underneath, and the GPU, the die specifically, is what we're after here. So we're gonna clean off some of the thermal pads with isopropyl alcohol. Of course, we'll clean the chip, get that nice and situated, put some fresh thermal paste on. These are actually phase sheets from Thermal Grizzly. You'll see a pre-roll for this coming up in a future video. And once it's all assembled, we can admire the sheer beauty of it all. I've gotta say, this thing cleans up super, super nice. Almost looks brand new. There aren't many scratches on this card, and frankly, it wasn't super dirty to begin with, which was super nice. It means the previous owner really took care of it, but we've got ourselves a pretty minty 1080 Ti here, and from a brand that unfortunately doesn't make graphics cards anymore, so this one's one to keep for sure. Now, a few years ago, if you'd asked me what card I thought from Team Green was the best value, I likely would have told you the GTX 1070. OGs know that we championed that card for years. For around 200 bucks, it was a really great buy on the used market, and it was a perfect alternative for cards in the 20 series family that were a bit confusing and, if you ask me, a bit pricey as well. The Turing architecture sort of kind of screwed things up a bit, and that's why I was falling back on used cards like the Pascal 1070s and 1080s and 980 Ti's from Maxwell so often, because I just thought that they presented a better value for folks who were building budget-conscious rigs. I find it kind of funny that I'm still recommending a 10 series card today, but I think the 1080 Ti is the last relevant card. It can still play modern titles, and you don't have to compromise too much in the way of in-game settings. Here's the proof. All of these games you're about to see have been tested in the 4K resolution, specifically 3840 by 2160, starting first with GTA 5. This one, with very high settings, no anti-aliasing, and no advanced graphics, is giving us a pretty consistent FPS of around 120, and it doesn't matter if we're flying or if we're on the ground, this game was super smooth. This would make sense though. This card was, again, pretty popular around the time that GTA 5 finally hit the PC space. You can see that it is pretty much being maxed out in terms of its utilization. Our CPU threads are just kind of chilling. This platform, by the way, is a Ryzen 7 7700X paired with 32 gigs of DDR5. I didn't think it made a ton of sense to compare a sub $200 graphics card today with like a totally clapped out platform, 7800X 3D, 14900K. That combination would probably never exist in the real world, and that's why I chose something kind of down the middle, still modern, and likely to not bottleneck anything we test here. Next on the list is F123. Now, if we had chosen a graphics card that supported DLSS, we could have used that to our advantage in this title and boosted our frame rate pretty dramatically. However, in this case, again, 2160p, we're in the low preset with just TAA, and we're averaging around 80 to 90 FPS. This is still very smooth. If you wanted to play a game like this on a bigger screen, say like a modern TV that's only really going to be capped at 60 FPS in most cases, I think this is totally playable. Now we move on to something a bit more cinematic, Starfield. 4K, a low preset, and no dynamic resolution, no scaling of any kind. We're averaging between 50 and 60 FPS here. Again, this title came out only a year ago, and for a card like this to still hold its own, pretty impressed. I'm not sure why this guy's rushing me right now. You can see that when the scene becomes a little more intensive, our frame rate drops to around 40. Some would say this is unacceptable, unplayable, and I totally hear those concerns. I just wanted to show you kind of a worst case scenario for a card like this. And we're not running like Witcher 3 with Hairworks or anything, but this is about as tough a title as any, and I think it's doing pretty well despite this card's age. Now we move on to Dirt 5. This title I expected to do a bit better. It's likely because we didn't enable FSR here, where we could have. Thankfully, AMD keeps this pretty open-ended, so we can run FSR with even NVIDIA and Intel graphics cards, and the 1080 Ti is no exception. I enabled that for another game that you're about to see, but for this one I wanted to turn it off and just see how we fared in 4K with the low preset. Around 80 FPS is acceptable for racing titles. I'd say minimum 60, but I'd prefer 120 if we could pull it off. It's just not really doable at 2160p. Now, if we drop to 1440p and especially 1080, we could definitely hold consistently above 100 FPS. I just wanted to keep the resolution consistent because I wanted to show you more of a worst case scenario for a card like this. Again, you can see that our utilization is around 100% for this graphics card, but the temperatures aren't bad. Around 70 degrees Celsius, repasting definitely helped. The last game on our list is The Finals, a fast-paced, modern, first-person shooter, and while I do have my qualms with it, this is actually free to download and play, so I can't complain too much, and it actually performed quite well, averaging over 100 FPS, though we did dip occasionally into the 90s, something I don't really like to see with games like this, but for a card that came out several years before this title did, I think it's still impressive. We do see more of our CPU being utilized here than we're used to, and that's great to see. It suggests that this title's a bit more optimized for higher and higher core count chips, but our GPU utilization has been pegged at 99%, pretty much the entire benchmark. It has not wavered once, and I think this is gonna explain at least partly why we see those infrequent frame rate drops. By the way, I'm recording everything here with an external capture card, so that should have no bearing on the system's performance whatsoever. Another positive takeaway from this, though, is that we're only utilizing around 6 gigs of VRAM. We have another 5 or so to spare, so that shouldn't be an issue at all with this game. So what's my verdict then on the GTX 1080 Ti here in 2024? Should you avoid it? Should you consider it? Or should you just go out and buy it? I say you should strongly consider it. It's almost an immediate buy, but I know that not everyone's gonna want a card this old. That's really the only thing holding this back. The fact that it's under $200 today is fantastic. You can get a lot of these cards in really good shape still in the middle of 2024, and with a bit of maintenance, a bit of cleaning, you can have it looking almost brand new like we have this one here. Ours ran extremely quiet under a heavy load. It didn't get too hot either thanks to our repasting, and it also looked pretty darn good in the process. And this AIB partner in particular did a really good job designing this model here. This 1080 Ti doesn't need 3 fans. It doesn't need, the beefiest shroud around, and I don't recommend you pay the premiums that some are asking on eBay for those larger variants. You saw in our testing, this card barely touched 70, 72 degrees Celsius under a hefty load. The graphics card for the most part part was being stressed heavily in our benchmarks because we were playing in 4K in every one of those instances, and the card still did not falter. So I don't think you need to spend more for the 3-fan variants. Get yourself a 2-fan like this one or from another reputable brand, and you will be just fine. That's all for this retrospective. Thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna have this card linked in the video description if you wanna check it out. We'll have it tied to an eBay affiliate program that we use. It pays us pennies on the dollar, but it does add up if you wanna buy a card from Amazon. Just make sure that you're buying, again, from a reputable seller, somebody that has great feedback, and make sure that you're buying a product that has great pictures included in the listing so that you know exactly what you're buying and there aren't any surprises. If you have recommendations for any graphics card that you'd like us to look at that is maybe a few years old, we'd love to throw that into our retrospective playlist. We're gonna see if we can turn this into a full-fledged series. I'm not gonna be doing the whole episodes and seasons thing, but I would like to look back at some older cards just because I feel like a lot of these are just flying under the radar. There's so much good value in the used market when it comes to graphics cards. It's difficult for me to ignore, and I hope that you'll consider one for your next budget PC build. That's all for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for learning with me.